Hello everyone, this is Ben Baver, one of the co-hosts of the Real Atheology podcast, and I'm here making this video as the beginning of a video series in which I will give an extended critique of Feser's first proof of the existence of God in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. And I'm making this series because the argument is so long that I thought it would be to everyone's benefit that we break it into manageable bits and then address those bits thoroughly. And so I'm going to start with the first stage of his argument, which is an argument to the existence of a purely actual actualizer or unmoved mover. And I will go through the premises in the formal presentation of his argument on pages 35 and 36 of his book. And it begins like this. Change is a real feature of the world, but change is the actualization of a potential. So, the actualization of potential is a real feature of the world. I'm not going to contest any of these three premises, although I think the second one, that change is the actualization of a potential, is contentious in metaphysics. I just don't know how to object to it at the moment, so I'm going to set that aside. I'll move on to the next couple of premises, which I do have an objection to. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. And he says in parentheses that this is the principle of causality. The next premise is, so any change is caused by something already actual. Now, I wouldn't object to this unless I had read the rest of the book where in other parts of this chapter he says that a potential is not something actual, and so it can't serve as an actualizer of potential. But I think this rests on a confusion, because although a potential is unactualized, when something has the potential to be cold, for example, it's merely potentially the case that it's cold. It's not actually cold. While it can be that a potential is unactualized, and in fact, that is by definition the case, a potential is still an actual thing. So a useful analogy here, I think, is the behavioral disposition that a baby has to cry at a given time if its pacifier is taken away. Imagine that its pacifier isn't actually taken away at that time. Well, it still has that disposition, that behavioral disposition to cry is actual, even though the disposition is never actualized. And so I think, likewise, an unactualized potential is an actual thing. It's just that, for example, in the case of a hot coffee's potential to become cold, it may not actually be cold because it hasn't been actualized, but it actually has this actual thing called a potential to be cold. And this point is going to become important further down in the argument, but I'll have to explain that later. Okay, moving on to the next bit of the argument, it says, the occurrence of any changed C presupposes something or substance S which changes. The existence of S at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. So, any substance S has at any moment some actualizer A of its existence. I have a small problem with this, so later on Feser is going to say that a purely actual actualizer exists. And I wonder why it is that if we say S exists, it follows that it has a potential for existence that's being actualized. But if we say a purely actual actualizer exists, that doesn't follow somehow. It doesn't follow that a purely actual actualizer has a potential for existence that's being actualized. And of course, I know a purely actual actualizer by definition is something that has no potential, but how does this follow? How is it supposed to follow from something's existing that it has a potential for existence, and not also follow for a purely actual, from purely actual actualizers existing, that it has a potential for existence that's been actualized. And you might say, well, the relevant difference is that a substance or thing is a particular being, whereas a purely actual actualizer is existence or being itself, or the ground of being, and it's not a particular thing or substance, so this principle doesn't apply to it. But I just don't see why that restriction is correct. Why is it not arbitrary? Maybe this will make my point clearer. So when I think about why it is that if something exists, then it has to have some potential for existence that's being actualized, all that seems relevant to me is the fact that it exists. It doesn't matter what it is that's existing. It doesn't need to be some particular being or substance. It's just the very fact that there is existing going on that suggests that there's this potential that's being actualized. And if that's the case, then if being itself or the ground of being exists, then that should also have some potential for existence that's being actualized. Okay, we're nearing the end of the first stage of this first proof now, and thank the unmoved mover for that, but we're about to get into the meat of my objections, so brace yourselves. The next part is, A's own existence at the moment it actualizes S itself presupposes either A, the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, or B, A's being purely actual. Now, what is Feser really saying here? Why is he saying this? Well, I take it that his thought process is something like this. If A exists, which it does, A exists, so it either has a potential to exist, which is being actualized, because of course it actually exists, so that potential is not unactualized, or it has no potential to exist, it just exists, and Feser thinks that he can rewrite this as A is purely actual. Well, why does he think that? Well, what it is to be purely actual is to lack any potential. So, at least part of it is to lack the potential to exist. But here's the problem. Lacking the potential to exist does not entail being purely actual, for two reasons. Well, even if all it takes to be purely actual is to lack any potential, lacking any potential to exist is not good enough to ensure that the thing is purely actual, because you have to also lack any other potential, like the potential to be cold, which we mentioned before, the potential to run, the potential to cause things, whatever. Here's the second reason I think lacking any potential to exist doesn't entail being purely actual. Well, even if lacking the potential to exist entails having no potential whatsoever, it doesn't entail being pure act, because part of what it is to be pure act is to not be a mixture of act and potency, as Thomas would put it. And that means it's not even partly potential. And one way to be partly potential is to have a potential. Well, we've ruled out that it has a potential, or we're assuming that. But it could still be partly potential if it were a potential, identical to a potential. And I think being identical to a potential does not entail having one. And here's where my previous point that a potential, being an actual thing, can have the capability to actualize potentials becomes important. So, if A is a potential, then A may be actualizing S, and this first disjunct A may be false, and yet A could fail to be purely actual. And so I think this premise is false. Rather than say, or B, A is being purely actual, it should say, or B, A is lacking any potential to exist specifically. On to the next part of Feser's argument. So he says, if A's existence at the moment it actualizes S presupposes the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, then there exists a regress of concurrent actualizers that is either infinite or terminates in a purely actual actualizer. Now that might seem kind of complicated and abstract, so I'm going to try to give a concrete example that makes it clear. I'll use an example that Feser himself gives in his book. He gives the example of coffee. So let's say S is coffee. What's actualizing the existence of coffee? Well, what exists at the same time that coffee exists? Water does, and it makes up most of the coffee. So it seems like it's actualizing the existence of the coffee. And so what Feser wants to say is that the existence of the water also must be actualized unless the water is purely actual. Since the antecedent of this premise, that is the part between if and then, is just the same thing as the first disjunct of the previous premise, which says that the water is being actualized while it actualizes the coffee, we can ignore the possibility for now that A is purely actual and has no potential. So what is actualizing A? That is water. Well, science tells us that hydrogen and oxygen atoms actualize water in much the same way that water actualizes coffee. That is, they compose the water. And so we can ask, well, what's actualizing those atoms? And now, as you can see, we're off on a regress just asking for each of these things, what is actualizing that? And it could be either that this goes on forever, or it could stop somewhere. And if it stops somewhere, Feser wants to say that it stops with a purely actual actualizer. And that's the only thing about this premise that I dispute. I think that if it stops somewhere, well, it doesn't have to be purely actual, because again, it could just lack the potential to exist, or it could be a potential. Next premise. But such a regress of concurrent actualizers would constitute a hierarchical causal series, and such a series cannot regress infinitely. And what I think he means by infinitely here is without beginning, or without a first member. Well, what's a first member? What he means by first member here is a member of the series that actualizes the next member, but is not actualized by another member. And so I think what defenders of the argument are thinking here is that if you say that every member is explained by a previous member, or is actualized by a previous member, then you can always ask for a given member, well, what's actualizing that? Where does it get its ability to actualize the next member? Because in order to get that ability, it must be actualized. It must exist, and so it must be actualized. But the opponent of the argument will just think that at every stage in the series, this question has an answer, because you can say, oh, it was just the previous member that actualized it. And there's always another previous member that actualizes any given member, because this series doesn't have a beginning. And so I'm kind of torn between these two intuitions. There's the defender's intuition that something is left unexplained, because you can always ask the question, well, what explained this member? And then there's the opponent's intuition that these questions are all answered, and so nothing is left unexplained, because the series is beginningless and there's always a previous member that answers the question. And I think either of these intuitions are equally strong, in which case we should suspend judgment on whether or not something is left unexplained, or the opponent has more of a point. Now, I could go into the rest of the premises, but I think at this point I've undermined those. So, see you in the next installment in this series.